Good morning. Welcome to the Boardwalk Talk series brought to you by the Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the Sea Lab. And this morning we are going to be chatting with Erin Bland, who is a PhD student in Dr. Ronald Baker's lab here at the Sea Lab. And Erin is working on a research project on tracking shoreline change. And so he's going to tell us a little bit about his research and about shoreline change and some of the challenges to conducting this work.
All right, thanks Mendel. So to get this talk started, I thought I would start with sort of, what's at stake when it comes to shorelines. Why are we so interested in going through the effort of finding shorelines, identifying them, and tracking them? And I have a few pieces of media here to help build that story. Starting with this top picture in my Night's Arts and Crafts panel.
Let me hold it up so there's no shadow.
Oh, thank you so much. I bet a lot of people will recognize that's the Dauphin Island Causeway. That's the road you take. Those of us who live and work, it is like our lifeline to the mainland. And if you're a visitor, that's the road you're going to take to easily visit our beautiful barrier island, Dauphin Island. And not a day goes by that I don't drive down that road that I don't think about shorelines and think about that particular shoreline with respect to that particular road, right? So as it is, there are times of year where it's not super safe to drive down that road, like during a nasty storm.
Let me grab another image so that we can show folks what it looks like over here, because for some people who don't know what this causeway looks like, they may not realize that there's water there.
Yeah, so there's actually water on either side of the road. So this road is very often at risk for periodic flooding, especially when the combination is high tide and a big storm just off ashore.
So it's right here.
There's some hard structure, some rocks or riprap, and that's actually that's a shoreline stabilization technique.
And this was done after Hurricane Sally last September of 2020.
I'm sure, I don't personally know what this road looked like after Sally, but I bet not very good. But yeah, so as it stands, this road, it requires periodic maintenance, and you sometimes need to avoid the road just from how close it is to the water. There's risk of flooding. If I can pass that to you real quick and show, when I Googled the Dauphin Island Causeway, this article came up near the top from al.com, more water on the road. We expect more debris on the road. Also, it would take a weaker storm to throw water on the road, to throw debris on the road. So that lands an important buffer, preventing water and nasty stuff from getting on your road. And for that reason, we would rather the shoreline to stay in place or perhaps even move toward the sea and stay away from our nice road, right? So that's one very important reason we care about shorelines. Now I'm going to move on to my next panel picture. This is a picture taken on the west end of Dauphin Island. This picture also has, in the background, a couple of properties, rental houses, or perhaps year-round residents, peoples with their beachfront homes. We like to build homes near the water. Who doesn't love to step out of their front porch and be at the ocean? But I bet these property owners are very much concerned about where that shoreline is in front of their property, right? They want to be beachfront. They don't want to be partially submerged within the ocean. Ocean water, if that shoreline was creeping in toward land, that means ocean water would be constantly splashing the foundation of their homes. They want to park their cars somewhere out there, and you don't want your car to get wet. So these property owners are very keen that that shoreline doesn't creep too far inland, right, to protect their private property. And then, finally, stepping away from my panel and focusing on our setting. So we're talking here at the boardwalk of the estuarium and with a great view of the living shoreline, the living marsh exhibit rather. And here I want to point out, this is another very important type of shoreline we're interested in preserving, your natural saltwater marsh. Saltwater marshes provide a lot of services. And most people think of saltwater marshes, they think of fish and beautiful seabirds and crabs. And they support a lot of life, a lot of energy, and that's just one of the many things saltwater marshes do for us. And marshes are threatened by a number of factors, but one of which just being they're shrinking. They're literally declining in the area of grass and mud and sediment coverage. And most of that shrinkage is happening at the front end, at the shoreline, moving inland, reducing the area of our vegetation cover. And that's also usually associated with a declining quality of marsh. Like you get fewer grasses or grasses of poor health. So those are for today, and there are other reasons, but those are my 3 big reasons why we care about shoreline position. We've got your public goods and spaces, private property, and natural habitats. So hopefully everyone agrees shorelines are important. We're keen to know where they are. Okay, now I think would be a good time to get a little more specific. If we look at our setting, if we look at this area, I can gesture broadly, right, and say, behold, the shoreline. But where, specifically, is the shoreline? What here can I point to and say, yep, that's the shoreline, and that is not the shoreline, right? And, a few things might come to mind. You might look at the water line. You might see, because, right, a shoreline is where the water meets the land. And that's sort of a reasonable first pass definition of a shoreline. But we know that water line, it changes pretty often, right? Every time a wave crashes onto shore, every time the tides come in and out, every time a storm blows in and out, that blows water up and down with respect to sort of that normal water level, right? And most of the time we don't want a definition of a shoreline that changes every minute, right? We want something more stable and long-term around which the water can move up and down, but the shoreline itself is relatively stable. So perhaps instead of the water line, how about we at least account for the tides and the variable storms? We can track how the tides change and come up with a so-called tidal datum, such as mean sea level, just the average water level, taking into account the up and down of the tides. And that's a reasonable definition of a shoreline. You could also, if you're really interested in those high tides, you can do the averages of the high tides, you could do the averages of the low tides. I came across a review paper that had, I think, 30 to 40 different features of a shoreline that different studies measure and look at and say, that's the shoreline, and that's how we're going to study the shoreline. And that's a lot for me to wrap my head around. And I'll tell you one very important measurement of shorelines, which is very relevant to our area and our research, is the edge of vegetation, edge of veg. So taking a look at our tidal marsh habitat, there's clearly an area where we see our saltwater marsh grasses, like our spartinas, growing. And then there's a front where you don't see those same vegetation growing, right? And there's a number of reasons why saltwater marsh plant would grow in one spot and not in another. But one of the most important reasons being saltwater marsh plants, they're very good at handling some amount of exposure to salt water. They're not good at being completely submerged because they need to breathe, they need oxygen. But they're not like our wimpy little land plants that can't handle even just a little bit of salty water. So they like to have that happy medium. That means they like to live somewhere in the tide. And those very front salt marsh plants are pretty good at being mostly submerged most of the time. And plants are long-lived, right? Plants don't come and go with the tides. Plants don't come and go when the weather turns nice or not. They're long-lived, they're stable. So in that way, they're actually a very good, for our purposes, measurement of a stable shoreline position, right? And also it's really helpful for us because when we are working to preserve shorelines, it is so often habitat like this. We're often specifically trying to preserve, you know, those marsh grasses. So it's helpful to have a measurement that takes into account gains or losses in terms of marsh grass, right? So those are and so we'll operationally use edge of edge a lot, although we understand depending on your application, you might use a different measurement of shoreline, right? You might not have marsh grass growing in front of your property. And then that's not super helpful for wondering, is your property going to get splashed with water or fall into the ocean? If you're really concerned about the water, maybe you focus on the high tide or the astronomical high tide or so on. So it sort of depends on your purpose, right?
And so to complicate this, because we're talking a matter of scale, so you're talking about a scale, you know, you mentioned daily changes in the water level with tides, and then you can have kind of seasonal changes with storms, and you're talking about plants being, you know, long-lived as a, you know, again, as a matter of scale. So that's relative. But the other complicating factor to this is that it's not just the water level that will change, it's also the land.
Yes.
So, and then, you know, the water level will change also with sea level rise on a different kind of scale. And then you may have erosion or subsidence of the land. You know, so this is a pretty complex thing to map out and to track.
It is, and I'm so glad you brought those factors up because I was just about to get into why do shorelines change? Why do they move? And you actually just highlighted everything I wanted to cover. So thank you for that. Yeah, and as you, just on that note, these different processes operate at different time scales, right? We know tides change every hour, but land moving up and down moves a lot more slowly than that, for example. And even the response of the plants, we expect to be sort of lagged to these other factors. But anyway, let's go over those factors because we've talked about shorelines, where they are, why they're important, and I've alluded to how they change, but why? Why do they change? Why don't they just stay in place like they should? In a global perspective, the amount of water in our oceans and the space they take up can change globally. And if there's more water in our global oceans, that means there's more water here on your local shore in coastal Alabama.
So let's highlight that for folks who may not be picturing this big picture that we're talking about. So the water on Earth, some of it is held in ice. And if the ice melts, then that water is no longer held in ice, it's flowing into the oceans. And so that will cause the water level of the oceans to rise. And then the warmer water itself expands. So you've got thermal expansion. So if you remember your basic chemistry classes, warmer, you know, molecules expand. So there's thermal expansion with the water that's in the ocean. So you get a couple of different factors that are causing more water in the ocean. So causing the sea level, the shoreline, to rise.
I guess since this boat came by, we'll take that opportunity to point out another reason why shorelines erode, right? A boat comes by, it produces wake. It produces waves just by its boat traveling. And we could see those waves hitting this structure here, this big pile of rocks, which I think we could argue what to call it, but I'll say it's a breakwater structure, maybe a breakwater jetty system, because at this other end, it's a nice, you know, sort of road for our nearby boat ramp. But yeah, so that boat wake, and of course, any sort of wave, any sort of natural wave can come and add water motion, which will travel to shore and encounter your shoreline. And your shoreline, at least the ones around here, tend to be made of sediment, dirt. So a beach, it's made of sand, and your saltwater marsh is made of clays and silts. And sediment can be brought to your shoreline. It can be carried on the water and on the wind and brought to a site and accumulate and sit there and build up your shoreline. And that's a way shorelines build up and out towards sea, more specifically. Rivers are also really good at entraining sediment as they flow and depositing sediment at the mouth of the river where it meets the ocean. That's a way shorelines actually build, but just as water bringeth, water can also taketh, right? And especially when we think about something like boat wake or something like storm waves, that really high energy water can come, crash into your shore, pick up sediment, and take it somewhere else. And that's sediment scouring or sediment erosion. And that's another important local reason why shorelines change, either accreting with sediment additions or eroding with sediment losses. And I guess on that point, well, no, let me finish the reasons why shorelines change before I bring this topic up. The other point Mendel had mentioned is how the land changes. So slowly, steadily, on a big geologic tectonic setting, land can move slowly up or down. In this area, it's actually moving down fairly rapidly compared to other parts of the country. And picture me standing here on Dauphin Island, watching the shore, and if I'm sinking because the land is moving down, the water appears to be creeping up, even though the water is really staying in place. And that concept is called relative sea level, the sea level with respect to our reference point on land. So we talked about how the sea level itself, the sort of absolute sea level, could be increasing, just more water in the ocean, and the water's taking up more space. But also those of us on land, some of us are sinking down, and those processes combined lead to sea level rise at our shorelines. Then we talked about sediment erosion and accretion. But then, and there's not so much we can do at a local scale about relative sea level changes, but we can do something about that sediment erosion and accretion. And we have the perfect example right behind us. So we saw that boat come by, generate boat wake, make a lot of big waves, and those waves crash up against Mendel pointed out we have a pretty cool marsh inhabitant here, just one of the many species supported by our beautiful saltwater marshes. This is a really cool spot. If you haven't had a chance to visit the estuarium boardwalk, I highly recommend it. Anyway, this breakwater structure, this big pile of rocks that's sitting parallel to shore, in line with shore, but offshore, we call those breakwaters. You see how the water activity is a lot higher beyond the breakwater than the water inside of it.
If you scan across.
And not only that, historically, oysters and oyster reefs functioned as breakwaters, because oysters grow attached to rock and they build up, they settle on each other's shells, the old dead shells, and oyster shell is nothing but another kind of rock, just made by a living thing. And so it used to be the case that oysters were so abundant in the Chesapeake Bay and in coastal Alabama that the reefs themselves they can grow here much better than they can grow stuck in the mud.
So I got a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So we're talking about kind of resolving shoreline or tracking shoreline, and we're talking about different time scales.
Yes.
So what kind of time solution are you looking at for tracking these changes?
That is a very good question, and it might make a little more sense when I sort of talk about what are our options for measuring it. But just briefly, for the project I'm working on, we are planning to go out and do the field work probably once a year at our shoreline sites, or I should say no more than once a year. It might even be every couple of years, because for some of our sites the change is relatively slow. For some of our sites it might be as fast as like a couple of meters of shoreline loss per year, so that's almost 7 trying to measure. Bay, which is near Lightning Point, I don't know if we want to pull up the map where that is. It's south of Bayou La Betre. Okay, so here we are on Dauphin Island. Bayou La Betre's over here. There's this point, we do some work out here, Point O'Pines, and appropriately named. And that's one of the world's most successful marsh restoration projects. Like, about a decade ago, that area was blown open. It was essentially an unprotected bay. And what people did is they brought in breakwaters. They called them wave attenuation devices. They're like big concrete pyramids with the top sliced off. So they're kind of trapezoidal shaped. And they're big enough that you see them sticking up out of the water. They put a big line of these huge, heavy concrete devices, and on top of that, they moved a bunch of sediment, they moved a bunch of mud back to the shoreline they're trying to restore, and then they sparsely planted marsh grasses. And what happened was, it just worked. So the system was effective at retaining sediment. We see the sediment has naturally built since the time people were there actually digging the sediment. And those sparsely planted plants, they grew well, and now it's densely packed marsh. So the plants just did a good job of reproducing and filling out that marsh.
So that happened here decades ago.
Oh yeah?
So this was the property that is now a concrete structure over there. It was a septic system, kind of in the hill that you see over there. And so they planted marsh here. So it was, it was an early marsh restoration project to see if you plant these plants, will they, plant a few, will they spread and populate this area?
I should say the planting of the plants is also an important part of the so-called living shoreline approach, because and we talked about how the breakwater, which may or may not have oysters on it, how that's important for breaking up wave energy. But marsh grass does a better job at holding on to sediment with its roots, keeping it from being scoured and swept away, than does, just bare mud, right? So the marsh plants are an important piece of it, in addition to all the other ecological services that marsh grasses provide. But it's so cool, I think, that they were able to just plant them sparsely, as in they said, instead of planting them as densely as they could, they plant one over here, and move away and put one over here, and then nature just took its course. And nature said, this is a great place to go grow marsh grass, and it's just going to fill out by itself.
And there was also a research project to look at the animals that had whether animals had populated this marsh, and how it might compare to a natural marsh. Because they didn't populate this with animals, they just planted the plants, as at the Lightning Point restoration site. And, the animals do indeed come to populate these restored areas. Well, so another question I have for you is, it can be very difficult to separate out these different factors, the relative sea level change, the subsidence from sea level rise.
Yes.
So do you have tools for separating those out, or do you just accept that there's going to be some ambiguity between, among, or some, error in determining, assigning a value to one versus another factor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way I see it, we're going to try. We're going to try to teach. So at the end of the day, hopefully I'll be able to tell you at this site, on average, we lost X many inches of shoreline per year. And then it's a fair question to say, okay, well, how many of those inches is because of global sea level? And how many of those inches is because the land moved up or down that many inches? And finally, how many inches of that is because of erosion? So global sea level is probably reasonably easy to estimate, or maybe even some sort of more regionally relevant measure of sea level. We can probably look that up. We can probably glean that. I think it's ultimately from tidal stations, like across the northern Gulf of Mexico. Will help us get at I had talked about mean sea level, for example. So if all these different tidal stations run by NOAA or some other scientific organization are tracking how water behaves for a decade, and then you can look at all that in all these different locations and come up with a trend of, here's how in this region our regional sea level has changed. And that's just one piece of our puzzle, right? So I expect we'll be able to attribute that component of shoreline change. And then I would have to rely on geological estimates. I don't expect we're going to directly measure tectonic subsidence. I'm going to leave that to geologists, but I think that's also something. So for instance, I had seen that here on Dauphin Island, relative sea level, due to the land moving and due to the water increasing, is that sea level is changing 1 inch every 2 years recently. So people are constantly coming up with estimates of relative sea level change for your local location. So we'll probably rely on those to explain that piece of the shoreline movement. And then our particular piece will say, okay, the rest of this we can probably attribute to erosion or accretion. We're not just planning to measure shoreline position, we're also planning to look at the lay of the land, the topography and bathymetry. That's just the ups and downs of the beach. You might call it the beach profile. And how you can imagine a very steep beach versus a very wide, flat, plain-like beach. And different amounts of sediment would need to be provided to make that go up or down. And of course, that's closely related to shoreline position. But you could have two beaches with the same shoreline in very different profiles.
So I think that, that we've pretty clearly outlined why this is important information. So you're relatively new to this area. Before
Yes.
moving here, you had been doing a different kind of work up in Delaware.
Yes.
So you haven't been working on this project too long. What is the ultimate kind of product for this, this information? Is it a map? Is it techniques for living shorelines? Is it both of those things?
Another very good question, and I don't know. There's a lot, and there's more than just in the Living Shorelines project in which I've been hired to work on. It's not just shorelines and bathymetry, but it's also oysters, and it's also fish, and it's also critters that live in the mud, and it's also the grass, and so.
So are you working on that, or is that someone else's part of this, component of this
So
project?
pieces of that overall project will be part of my dissertation work. So hopefully I might come up with a paper on shoreline position. I might come up with another paper on the oysters that are trying to grow on these breakwater structures. Someone's going to write a paper on the fish that show up at our different locations. But you asked about products, and I would say generally, what's the goal of comparing these different sites? And to be more specific, we're comparing living shoreline sites, places where people want to address shoreline loss as determined through the shoreline science I'm about to get into. We want to reverse that erosion by, and there's a few different strategies, but generally it's you put in something like a breakwater, some hard structure offshore to break up that wave energy, because those waves, that erosion, can be a very important determinant of shoreline change at your specific shore. And then also to plant vegetation at the marsh edge, to plant those Spartina marsh grasses so that the marsh grows. Hopefully, if it works well, they will grow on their own and they will bring in the sediment. And we're really interested in oysters because, when you just have rock, when you just have inorganic rock, it just sits there and it might even sink into the mud over time. It might subside on its own and not be as effective. If this got covered in water, it wouldn't break up the waves as well. But oysters are living and they're growing. And in theory, they can keep growing up even as sea level increases and even as that rock subsides. That's a big if though. So far, it doesn't look like the oysters are doing so well in these structures, but I'm really just getting started to make those determinations.
There are a lot of different factors that will affect the oyster growth too.
Yes. And I guess to tie it together, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to, since so many different players have worked to protect our shorelines in different places with different strategies, and not every site, no two sites are alike. All these factors that we're talking about might be a little bit different at each of our locations. Well, now I need to come in and say which strategies worked the best, or which strategy might have worked better for this place versus that place. And there are some challenges to compare these places because it's sometimes like comparing apples and oranges. But I guess my job is to fit the apple to the orange somehow.
Well, and then too, and often in research, and then because these have economic and political and cultural, societal implications as well. People like to be able to assign numbers to these things.
Yes.
But it's a pretty complicated task to put numbers on a lot of these different factors.
I do think people are sort of looking for me to give you, here's one number to give you an average rate of shoreline change for the whole time I monitored it. When really, even for a particular shoreline, we could talk about how this patch of the shoreline is accreting and building, and that patch over there is eroding, moving back, or they're accreting or eroding at different rates. And so it's really...
And then the numbers extend as well to things like, the amount of time, the cost, the cost of these restoration projects, the economic impact, what kind of benefit it's going to have, and then... we could talk about the ecosystem services that we might assign value to.
Perhaps,
so people like to assign numbers to these things, but that's a pretty difficult task.
To throw another wrinkle, perhaps what's good for shorelines, perhaps the best breakwater I can tell you will help protect your shoreline, maybe that's not a good breakwater for growing oysters on, right? So there might be trade-offs. So that's something I'm starting to think about. Maybe we don't have time to wait for those oysters to grow up and slowly build up over time. And if we do that, our shoreline is going to turn to dust while we're waiting for the oysters to grow, right? So there's a lot of response variables that we're tracking: the fish, the oysters, the shoreline, the marshes, and I expect them to go every which way. And I'm going to try and take some time, and we'll do the work first of all, but also take the time to wrap our head around, well, how do we communicate? How can we give this a bottom line to people to say what works and what doesn't? I expect it to be complicated, but we'll try our best to make it less so.
And so were you going to tell us a little bit more about so we've been throwing around the term living shorelines, but I think maybe we haven't really sort of defined living shorelines.
Sure. Yes. So let me start by saying there's a so-called traditional approach to protecting shorelines, shoreline hardening. As the name implies, it involves hard structures. So that could include hard structures like breakwaters. It could include structures, yeah, if we can look here at the dock, you know, those pilings.
So there's like a wall right there.
Yeah, seawalls are another example. So those are structures that, we won't say that they're totally permanent, but we'll say they erode much more slowly than your sedimented marsh, right? And we could go and fix them and build them up and reinstall them if we need to, although we'd rather not, because that's time and money. So that's one approach to protecting shorelines, but you know, some people in some contexts might take issue with just relying on that. So if you armor your shoreline with like a seawall or a bulkhead, like a big wall right up against the shore you're protecting.
Well, they tend to change the erosion problems rather
Yes.
than eliminate them.
Yes.
So you can get like, they'll shift like where the erosion happens. So for example, with that wall, you might have erosion that's below the wall, and then you'll get sediment falling down into the water behind the wall. And you might also shift it to your neighbor's property.
That energy has to go somewhere. So whether it bounces to the left or to the right to your neighbor, it might also bounce down. It might be scouring the sediment that's underwater, maybe even the sediment that's holding up your structure in the first place, so that could subside. So it's not, I mean, it's often the quickest way to protect your particular shore. Could be expensive, and it could have unintended consequences, right? So we contrast that traditional shoreline hardening with living shorelines. It's a little bit loosey-goosey of a term, but it generally means incorporating natural living materials. It's shoreline protection organic style, right? And so I've talked about the importance of marsh grasses, what marsh grasses do to stabilize the soil. I've talked about oysters, how they can slowly grow, build up over time, and function as a breakwater. But the exciting thing being they can grow as fast as sea level changes, and they can grow as their reef is subsiding. So there are a variety of things that fall under the tent of living shoreline, but those are some of the main ones we think about, generally the oysters and the marsh grass. Okay.
Is there something that you would kind of like to leave folks with as kind of a broad message?
So,
well, okay, so I think that maybe we should point out to people, if they live on the shore, if they have property on the shoreline, you know, they may have hardened structure already. You know, it requires maintenance. There are now a lot of efforts to, you know, as these things are exhibiting wear and they're needing to be repaired or replaced anyway, to shift towards the living shoreline approach. And there's been a lot of kind of development of that approach in our area, because Mobile Bay has a lot of the armored shoreline, but there's more and more opportunity for, you know, for homeowners and property owners. So.
Yeah, I guess I am hesitant to recommend this shoreline approach for your individual needs, because it's pretty likely that the armored shoreline in the short term will do generally what you need it to do. You might not have the time again to wait for your reef to develop. You might not be interested in planting a big saltwater marsh in front of your property, but if you are, kudos to you. I think that would make a splendid backyard. Yeah, and I think, and we talked about, again, no two locations are alike, so it depends on what factors are at play for your specific patch of shoreline, and at this time it'd be hard for me to just sort of give a general advice. I think your situation would vary. I wonder if, I know we might be running short of time, if I could at least very quickly give an overview of what we actually do to measure shorelines.
Yeah.
And I made a quick demonstration. This is actually something really anyone can do at home using programs like Google Earth. I have here 3 pictures.
Now hold it so you can point.
Sure, thank you. We have 3 pictures of the west end, the developed end of Dauphin Island. You can see the west end beach and some properties. Google Earth has a function where you can go back in time to have a timeline. And you can see I have a panel here for as this place looked in 2005, 2012, and 2020. And I just did something really easy. I picked a patch of shore and I drew just a straight line, that orange line you see here for 2005. I drew a blue line here for 2012. And then I brought those same lines to our picture here in 2020. And you could see first of all how the lines had moved with the orange, with our old 2000 line being the furthest out to sea, followed by our blue line. And then you can see, it's much more clear when you can zoom in, but the shoreline did indeed move beyond the blue line, the 2012 line. So at each step, I measured about 30 feet of shoreline retreat. Depends on where you measure it, of course. And this is, you know, the general idea.
So, I mean, that's really cool, and I'm glad you pointed that out. But let's also point out the change between on the north side of Dauphin Island.
Yeah, and you know, the north side is perhaps even more dramatic.
Just for a show of how dramatically a barrier island can change in just a few years.
I guess I wonder though, because people move sand around, they move the sediment, like as a human activity, of course, to preserve our wonderful West End Dauphin Island. So I'm not sure what I can attribute to natural processes versus sediment being pushed around.
If you look directly after storms, so if you identify some big dates for hurricanes such as Hurricane Ivan and Hurricane Katrina, and you can pull images from before that and then images after, and so you can see some dramatic movement of sand that can be attributed to hurricanes.
Very cool. And then just to say what we as scientists do, it's pretty much this, just a little bit more effort. So I drew a nice straight line. You actually want to get the details right, get individual points as the shoreline moves up or down. I wouldn't necessarily use just the images on Google Earth. The USGS has satellite imagery and plane imagery available online for us to use. So that's historical imagery. We also have instruments. You can take GPS instruments to a field and have someone actually walk the shoreline and see. So that takes effort, right? You have to make a field day out of it. But that's a really good way to get a highly accurate representation of your shoreline.
What's the resolution on GPS? So it used to be scrambled, so it didn't have as high a resolution.
Let me flip this around, because we don't just use any old GPS. I'll point out this picture, which I need to give credit to the Sebrian lab for this picture. And we can see a scientist holding what's called an RTK GPS. So this works a little differently than the instrument in our pockets. There's what's not pictured here. There's some sort of base station that connects to satellites as well as this instrument, which we note it's on a pole. It's really high up, so it has really good view of the satellites and your base station. This thing is connected to the satellites and that base station too. And together that whole system leads to a very, very accurate GPS, like centimeter level accuracy. And so since this is a game of inches and not a game of feet, we are interested with these walked shorelines getting that very high resolution shoreline imagery. We obviously can't go back and do that for the 1950s, right? We'll have to rely on whatever historical imagery we have to do those. And those images, sometimes they're not super helpful because it depends on the resolution, right? Sometimes the individual pixel of your image represents 10 feet, right? And then I say, okay, the shoreline is here, plus or minus 10 feet. It's not really good enough for our purposes.
Again, there's another layer of complexity to this work.
If you really need to go the aerial imagery route and you need high resolution, use a drone. Yeah, if it's not a good idea to walk the shoreline, maybe there's too many gators on your marsh, bring a drone, get a certified drone operator, and that will get you really high resolution pictures, which are excellent for mapping shorelines.
So are you expecting to do any drone work?
We have someone in our lab who's a certified drone technician, so I'm probably going to leave it to her. Maybe she'll let me play with the controls when no one's looking.
Well, anything else that you'd kind of like to leave us with?
I guess I hope I communicated why shorelines are important, the complexities involved in tracking them, and all the different reasons they change. And I guess if you want to learn more, stay tuned. Give me about 5 years, and I'll may have a
Well, we'll
dissertation,
get you
put it
back
all together.
to do an update.
Yeah, I'd love to do this again. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks for joining us this morning and talking to us about your work and about shorelines. And thank you for joining us at home.